What if your body dies, but your mind survives? Not metaphorically. Literally. Imagine your head, your brain, your consciousness, removed from your dying body and connected to a brand new one. A healthy, younger, maybe even genetically enhanced body. Suddenly, death doesn't mean the end. It means a reset. This isn't science fiction anymore. The idea of a human head transplant has moved from the pages of pulp novels into the labs of fringe neurosurgeons, daring biotechnologists, and controversial medical pioneers. The question is no longer if it's possible to escape death, but when. And more hauntingly, should we even try? The concept is staggering. For centuries, philosophers, alchemists, and scientists have searched for a way to defeat mortality. Ancient civilizations imagined elixirs of life, while modern billionaires are pouring fortunes into cryogenics, anti-aging drugs, and even brain uploading. But among the boldest ideas ever conceived stands the head transplant, an audacious proposal that suggests we might preserve human life by relocating the mind to a new body. Think about what that really means. Your thoughts, your memories, your personality, everything that makes you, cut away from your failing flesh and attached to something younger, stronger, or maybe even synthetic. The promise is seductive. If the body fails, replace it. If death approaches, outrun it. Some call it the next step in evolution. Others call it madness. The science is both fascinating and terrifying. Researchers have already succeeded in transplanting heads in animals. Surgeons claim they've connected blood vessels and kept brains alive during the procedure. And one doctor, drive. Sergio Canavero has publicly declared that he intends to perform the world's first human head transplant. He's not asking if we can escape death. He's saying it's time to try. But behind the headline-grabbing claims lies a whirlwind of ethical dilemmas, medical skepticism, and philosophical shockwaves. Can a head transplant really work? Will the brain accept the new body? What happens to identity, memory, and the soul? And most importantly, does surviving like this count as truly living? This video dives deep into those questions. We'll explore real-world attempts to conduct head transplant surgery. We'll uncover the radical science pushing the boundaries of life and death. We'll revisit chilling animal experiments and controversial human case studies. And we'll ask the one question no one dares to say out loud: what if escaping death comes at the cost of losing what it means to be human? So sit tight. Because what you're about to discover will blur the lines between science and science fiction, between life and death, and between what is and what could be. This isn't just about medicine. This is about the future of human immortality, and whether we're already on the path to becoming something entirely new. The science behind a head transplant. to understand the idea of escaping death through a head transplant, we first have to understand what a head transplant actually is, and just as importantly, what it is not. Most people confuse the term with brain transplants, but they are two radically different concepts. A brain transplant would involve removing just the brain, disconnecting it from its sensory organs, muscles, blood vessels, and cranial structure, and placing it into a new skull. That, as of today, is pure science fiction. A head transplant, on the other hand, involves taking the entire head, complete with the brain, eyes, mouth, spinal column stub, and circulatory system, and attaching it to a donor body. The skull remains intact. The eyes still see. The ears still hear. The vocal cords, though foreign, can still speak. In theory, the personality, thoughts, and memories would remain untouched because the brain is left physically whole. This is what has scientists and futurists so captivated. If you can keep the head alive, and successfully connect it to a new body, then the mind survives. And with it, identity. But how exactly does a head transplant work? The procedure, on paper, is a logistical and biological nightmare. It begins with two individuals, one brain-dead body donor and one recipient, whose body is failing but whose brain is still intact. Both are cooled to hypothermic temperatures to slow cellular decay and reduce oxygen needs. The head of the recipient and the donor's body are severed almost simultaneously, under the most sterile and carefully coordinated conditions imaginable. The next steps are where science meets science fiction. Surgeons must align the vertebral columns of both parties precisely. Then comes the spinal cord fusion, the single most controversial and technically impossible part of the operation. The spinal cord contains millions of nerve fibers, all responsible for movement, touch, pain, and motor control. Slicing through the spinal cord and then expecting it to refuse is something current medicine does not yet know how to do successfully in humans. Dr. Sergio Canavero, however, believes otherwise. He proposes using a special substance called polyethylene glycol, or PEG, to encourage the axons in the spinal cord to regrow and reconnect. His surgical protocol, called the Gemini method, claims to make this fusion possible by fusing the white matter of both spinal cords at the molecular level. PEG has shown some promise in animal studies, but there is still no human data that confirms it can restore full motor and sensory control. Critics argue it's a leap of faith. Canavero calls it a leap of science. Even if the spinal cord could be fused, the blood vessels between the head and body must be meticulously connected. The brain requires constant oxygen, and even a brief interruption could cause irreversible damage. Surgeons must also reconnect the trachea for breathing, the esophagus for swallowing, and countless muscles and nerves that control facial expressions, speech, and vision. Each reconnection has to be perfect, or the head risks massive rejection, stroke, or paralysis. Then comes the immune response. Even if everything is technically connected, the body may still reject the head, or the head may reject the body. In most organ transplants, anti-rejection medications are used to suppress the immune system and allow the foreign tissue to remain. But in a head transplant, the immune mismatch is far more complex. You're not dealing with one organ, you're dealing with an entire system, with a full set of foreign DNA, blood markers, and chemical signatures. The brain and body will have to negotiate a fragile peace, or the patient's immune system will declare war. One of the most profound challenges is consciousness. Even if the head survives, even if the spinal cord is fused and the heart starts beating again, even if the nerves are rewired and the person opens their eyes, what exactly wakes up? Is it still the same person? Or has something fundamental been lost? The question of consciousness transfer is more than medical, it's philosophical. You can move a head, but can you move a self? Interestingly, this field has drawn comparisons to another growing area of research, xenotransplantation. Scientists are already exploring how to transplant animal organs into humans, most notably, pig hearts into human patients. In 2022, a man named David Bennett received the first genetically modified pig heart in a groundbreaking surgery. He survived for 2 months. Although the case ended in death, it demonstrated that animal-human transplants are no longer theory. They are active, evolving science. Xenotransplantation may not be directly related to head transplants, but the parallels are striking. Both fields challenge our understanding of life, death, and the boundaries of the human body. Both fields require genetic engineering, advanced immunosuppression, and radical surgical innovation. And both fields force us to ask, if we can rebuild the human body with parts, human or otherwise, what makes a person who they are? The brain, the body, the soul. The science of head transplants is still in its infancy. No successful full-body human head transplant has ever been completed, despite the headlines and public declarations. The procedure remains theoretical. But the groundwork is being laid in pieces. Advances in neural regeneration, breakthroughs in stem cell therapy, new forms of surgical robotics, and an increasing willingness by some in the scientific community to ask the unthinkable. So when we talk about how head transplants work, it's not just about surgery. It's about a collision between neurology, ethics, engineering, and imagination. It's about understanding the body not as a fixed structure but as a replaceable shell. It's about pushing the boundaries of human resilience and asking whether the brain, the crown jewel of consciousness, can be rehomed without losing what makes us human. This is not science fiction for long. With each medical breakthrough, the gap between fantasy and reality narrows. We are entering an era where spinal cord fusion is no longer laughable. Where artificial blood is being tested. Where brain-machine interfaces are mapping consciousness like never before. And where, for better or worse, the science of head transplants is moving closer to the operating room. Because in a world where death is no longer absolute, the question isn't how head transplants work. The real question is, How far are we willing to go to make them work? The man who wants to do it, Dr. Sergio Canavero. If there is one name synonymous with the idea of human head transplants, it's Dr. Sergio Canavero. A neurosurgeon from Italy, Canavero has become both a symbol of unrestrained ambition and a lightning rod for controversy. In the medical world, few figures have stirred such intense debate, not just because of what he proposes, but because he insists it's not just theory. He believes it can and should be done. Sergio Canavero first came into the public spotlight with a declaration so bold it sounded like science fiction. He claimed he could perform the world's first human head transplant. This wasn't a casual thought experiment or an abstract paper buried in some obscure journal. It was a confident, deliberate, and very public claim. In interviews, press conferences, and scientific articles, he laid out the details of his plan and the urgency behind it. For patients facing terminal illness, degenerative muscle conditions, or full body paralysis, this wasn't just a theoretical discussion. It was a last hope. Canavero named his plan the Heaven Project. The acronym stands for Head Anastomosis Venture. Anastomosis refers to the surgical connection of two body parts, typically blood vessels or nerves. In this case, the term takes on a far more profound meaning: the merging of one person's head with another person's body. The project aims to demonstrate that such a transplant could be achieved with precision, safety, and ultimately, life-saving success. Central to this project is another innovation from Canavero, which he calls the Gemini spinal cord fusion technique. One of the greatest hurdles in any potential head transplant is the spinal cord. Severing and rejoining this delicate highway of nerve tissue without losing functionality has long been considered medically impossible. But Canavero believes that by using a carefully coordinated surgical method combined with chemical agents like polyethylene glycol, a compound known to encourage the fusion of lipid membranes, this challenge can be overcome. The Gemini protocol, he argues, is the key to restoring motor function, sensation, and even voluntary movement after a transplant. Naturally, the world reacted to these announcements with shock. Some saw brilliance. Others saw madness. Within the scientific community, the response was overwhelmingly skeptical. Major medical journals dismissed his work as speculative at best, irresponsible at worst. Leading neurologists criticized the lack of peer-reviewed evidence and the ethical risks associated with such an experimental surgery. The concern wasn't only whether the surgery would fail, it was what would happen if it somehow succeeded. Could a human being survive the ordeal of a head transplant? Would the patient retain consciousness, or suffer some new form of trauma that we can't yet define? Would it be ethical to subject someone to such an uncertain fate, even with consent? These are not small questions, and they have kept Canavero at odds with much of the medical establishment. But while critics attacked the feasibility and morality of the project, Canavero remained defiant. He claimed that history would vindicate him, just as other pioneering surgeons were once ridiculed for proposing now standard procedures like organ transplants, in vitro fertilization, and face transplants. He pointed to animal experiments that had already been conducted over the past century, some of which had shown limited success in keeping heads alive for hours or even days post-surgery. In 2015, Canavero shocked the world again by announcing that he had found a human volunteer. Valery Spiridonov, a Russian computer scientist suffering from a terminal muscle wasting disease, agreed to become the first patient. He understood the risks. But he also believed the potential reward, a new, functional body, was worth any danger. The announcement made headlines around the world. The idea of a man trading in his dying body for a new one captured the imagination of millions. But the surgery never took place. Years passed. The volunteer backed out. And questions about the project's legitimacy began to grow. Still, Canavero continued his research. In 2017, he claimed to have successfully performed a head transplant on 2 cadavers in China, proving that the surgical steps were physically possible. Later that same year, he suggested that a full transplant on a living human could happen in the near future, depending on the availability of funding, regulatory approval, and ethical clearance. He even suggested that China might be the first nation to allow it, due to fewer legal restrictions and a more open attitude toward radical biomedical research. His critics did not relent. Many accused him of chasing fame, exploiting desperate patients, and dragging science into the realm of spectacle. But Canavero stood firm. He insisted that head transplant surgery wasn't about ego or shock value. It was about progress. About offering an option, however extreme, to those who had none. And in the process, redefining what it means to save a life. Today, Sergio Canavero remains one of the most polarizing figures in modern medicine. His vision has not yet materialized. But his ideas have already changed the conversation. What once seemed absurd is now being debated in neuroscience symposiums and bioethics panels around the globe. Whether or not his dream ever becomes a reality, he has forced the world to confront a possibility few dared to imagine, that human identity might not be bound by the body it was born into. The legacy of Canavero may be one of controversy, but it's also one of confrontation. He's made science face one of its greatest taboos, the possibility of escaping death through surgery. And whether he succeeds or not, that question won't go away. Case study: Valery Spiridonov and the world's first attempt. In 2015, a man named Valery Spiridonov captured global attention when he volunteered to become the first human ever to undergo a full head transplant. A Russian computer scientist in his early 30s, Spiridonov wasn't seeking fame. He was seeking a future. Born with Wernicke-Hoffmann disease, a severe form of spinal muscular atrophy, his body had been deteriorating since infancy. By the time the world met him, he was confined to a wheelchair, his movements limited, his muscles wasted. Yet his mind remained sharp, determined, and fully aware. For Valery, the decision wasn't driven by madness or desperation. It was fueled by logic. He believed that his brain, the seat of his identity, was still functional, still alive. The body, he said, was just a vehicle. If the engine failed but the computer still worked, why not replace the frame? His words were chillingly pragmatic. I'm not afraid to die, but I'm afraid not to try. He reached out to Dr. Sergio Canavero after reading about his proposed heaven head transplant procedure. Spiridonov wasn't just willing, he was eager to become the first. Their announcement was met with a storm of media frenzy. The images of the frail Russian scientist and the defiant Italian surgeon spread like wildfire. For a moment, it felt like science fiction was on the brink of becoming science fact. But the road to the operating table would not be so simple. As soon as the plan was made public, the backlash began. Bioethicists condemned the idea. Medical boards warned of potential malpractice. Neurologists insisted that spinal cord fusion in humans was impossible with today's technology. The medical community demanded rigorous testing and peer-reviewed results before any human trial could take place. Critics didn't just question the science. They questioned the ethics. Was Spiridonov truly informed about the risks? Or was he being used as a human guinea pig in a surgery with no precedent? Despite the criticism, Spiridonov stood by his decision for years. He gave interviews, participated in press events, and openly discussed the emotional toll of living in a body that felt more like a prison than a home. But time passed, and the promised surgery never came. Years later, in a surprising turn of events, he withdrew from the project. He cited a change in family circumstances and new personal priorities. But the deeper truth may have been something more complex, an awareness that the technology simply wasn't ready. The procedure had been publicly declared, but behind the scenes, the logistical and ethical hurdles proved insurmountable. There was no hospital that would agree to host it. No ethics board willing to sign off. No government that wanted its medical community associated with a surgery that many labeled a failed head transplant case before it even began. And as more time passed, it became clear that the first attempt would not happen, not then, and not with Spiridonov. But even though the surgery never took place, Valery Spiridonov left a lasting imprint on the global consciousness. His willingness to participate reignited debates about life extension, bodily autonomy, and the extremes people are willing to go to escape death. He forced the world to consider questions it wasn't ready to answer. Is the brain all we are? Can one man's quest to survive justify pushing the boundaries of medicine beyond what we know? Spiridonov's story is not one of failure, it's one of audacity. He put a human face on a concept that had long existed only in speculation. He reminded us that medical innovation often begins not in sterile labs, but in the courage of individuals willing to risk everything for the chance to live differently. Today, Valery lives in Russia with his wife and child. He continues to work in the tech sector, having built a life within the limits of his condition. But for a brief time, he was at the center of a medical and philosophical storm. A man who dared to ask, out loud and without fear, whether the mind could be given a second chance, even if the body could not. His case remains the most famous and the most controversial in the history of head transplant proposals. And while no scalpel ever touched his neck, his decision cracked open a door that may never fully close again. Because as long as people like Valery Spiridonov exist, the question will remain, is it truly madness to risk everything when the alternative is certain death? Animal head transplants, chilling experiments in history. Long before humans were considered for head transplants, the idea was tested on animals, often in horrifying, controversial, and ethically disturbing ways. These experiments weren't just about pushing the limits of science. They were attempts to answer one chilling question: can a living head survive on a different body? What resulted was scenes that seemed more at home in horror films than hospital labs, yet they laid the foundation for everything we know about transplanting a head, even if only temporarily. The earliest and most infamous animal head transplant experiments took place in the Soviet Union in the 1950s. A scientist named Vladimir Demikhov, working under the banner of scientific advancement during the Cold War, stunned the world by performing a series of head transplantation procedures on dogs. These were not subtle surgeries. Demikhov actually grafted the head and forelimbs of one dog onto the neck of another. The result was a two-headed canine, both heads alive, both able to blink, drink, and even react independently. Photographs and films of these creatures, dubbed bicephalic dogs, spread quickly across the globe. They were grotesque and fascinating. The transplanted heads would lick their lips, move their eyes, and even try to bite lab assistants. But the results were short-lived. These dogs rarely survived more than a few days. Immune rejection, organ failure, and severe infection took their toll quickly. Still, Demikhov's work was considered groundbreaking at the time, not only because of its audacity but because it proved that a severed head could remain functional if blood flow was maintained. Yet these experiments didn't offer a blueprint for success. They revealed serious limitations. The spinal cords were never fused. The transplanted heads could not control the donor body. No real integration occurred between the host and the graft. What Demikhov demonstrated was survival, not restoration. Years later, on the other side of the Iron Curtain, the United States would attempt its own version of this unsettling science. Dr. Robert White, a neurosurgeon based in Cleveland, took Demikhov's experiments further, but with primates. His work in the 1960s and 70s pushed the envelope of what was medically possible and ethically permissible. White was fascinated with the brain and determined to discover whether it could be maintained independently from its original body. His approach was clinical, calculated, and equally controversial. In a now infamous series of procedures, Robert White removed the head of one monkey and successfully attached it to the body of another. The transplanted monkey head regained consciousness. It could open its eyes. It responded to touch. It even tracked movement with its eyes and reacted to sounds. This was not a fluke or a momentary twitch of dying nerves. The head was alive and aware. But like the Soviet dogs before it, the monkey could not move its body. The spinal cord had been severed and was not reconnected. There was no sensation below the neck. The animal had no control over its new host body. White didn't claim victory, but he did make a chilling observation: the brain could live outside its native body, if the circulatory system was properly maintained. The monkey survived for 8 days before the body ultimately rejected the foreign head. White's work drew international attention and deep criticism. Animal rights advocates decried the suffering imposed on the test subjects. Bioethicists questioned the value of an experiment that produced no quality of life. But from a scientific perspective, the surgeries revealed something astonishing. Consciousness, at least in part, could be preserved. The concept of the brain as an isolated organ, separate from the rest of the body, was no longer theoretical. These were the first real cases where a living brain, attached to a foreign body, retained some signs of cognitive function. Still, the limitations were clear. Without spinal cord fusion, there was no communication between the head and the host body. No voluntary movement. No integration. Just an isolated brain riding on a lifeless frame. The immune system, even with powerful drugs, reacted violently. Survival time was minimal. These were not successful transplants in any modern sense. They were controlled demonstrations of biological endurance, and perhaps warnings of the boundaries science was not yet ready to cross. Despite the failure to produce long-term survival or functional recovery, these experiments had a profound influence on medical thought. They showed that, under very specific conditions, a severed head could live. Blood flow, oxygen, and temperature regulation could keep a brain alive outside its original shell. These discoveries would later inform the development of life support systems, organ transplant protocols, and even coma management techniques. But in the context of head transplantation, they also proved how far we still had to go. Demikov and White approached their research from different ideological fronts. One worked under the cloud of Cold War secrecy, the other operated under the scrutiny of American academia. Yet both chased the same question with unnerving conviction: is the mind truly bound by the body? Their experiments did not answer that question definitively. But they cracked the door open just wide enough for future scientists to see what might be possible, and to wonder, with both fear and fascination, whether one day a human head might do more than survive. It might live, move, and think again, on a new body. These animal head transplant experiments remain some of the most haunting and thought-provoking in modern science. They did not offer solutions. They offered puzzles. They didn't deliver immortality. They revealed the price of chasing it. But perhaps most importantly, they set the stage for what would become one of the most controversial and enduring ambitions in medicine: the dream of full body replacement, of escaping death by switching vessels, and of asking science to do something that nature never intended. The moral and ethical dilemma. As the science of head transplants inches closer to the realm of possibility, the conversation shifts from surgical precision to moral weight. The question is no longer just about feasibility. It becomes about ethics. About humanity. About whether this is a road we should walk, even if we find out we can. Are we pushing the limits of healing, or are we crossing a line into playing God? At the core of this dilemma lies a haunting uncertainty. What makes a person who they are? Is it the brain that houses our memories, thoughts, and consciousness? Or is it the body that carries our experiences, senses, and biology? If identity is defined by the mind alone, then moving the head from one body to another should preserve the self. But if the body contributes to who we are, through hormonal balance, immune response, or even the rhythm of a heartbeat, then what emerges after such a transplant may not be the same person who went under the knife. The split between brain and body has divided philosophers for centuries. Some argue that consciousness lives in the brain and nowhere else. Others suggest the body plays a crucial role in shaping how we think, feel, and even love. If a man wakes up in another man's body, but with his original brain, what is he now? And who gets to decide? The ethics of head transplants force us to re-examine human identity and consciousness in uncomfortable new ways. Consent becomes a major issue. In a typical surgery, a patient gives informed consent knowing the risks, the benefits, and the potential outcomes. But in the case of a head transplant, how do you give meaningful consent when no precedent exists? There's no data to show what recovery looks like, no way to predict psychological effects, and no guarantee of consciousness retention. Even the most well-informed patient is walking into the unknown, agreeing to something that may not just fail, it may erase them. Identity itself becomes a legal and social puzzle. If someone undergoes a head transplant, who are they after the operation? Is their legal name still valid? Are they the same citizen? Do they retain the same rights? Marriage, inheritance, citizenship, all of these systems are built on the assumption that the body and the person are inseparable. But if a person changes their body entirely, those assumptions collapse. The issue of the soul cannot be ignored. For many religious traditions, the soul is not something that can be relocated. It is rooted either in the heart, the breath, or the divine order. A head transplant challenges that theology directly. If the brain is moved and the person continues to live, did the soul travel with it? Or has something sacred been lost in the exchange? Religious scholars warn that such procedures may represent a transgression, a form of bio-arrogance that disrupts the natural cycle of life and death. Then there is the frightening possibility of exploitation. The morality of immortality hinges not only on what is done, but who it is done for. If head transplants ever become viable, will they be available to the average person? Or will they be reserved for the wealthy elite, those who can pay to replace their bodies every few decades, essentially cheating death while the rest of the world watches? The idea of surgical immortality accessible only to billionaires paints a dystopian future where the rich don't just live better, they live forever. This opens the door to darker concerns. If full body replacement becomes possible and profitable, how long until criminal markets take notice? The potential for body trafficking becomes terrifyingly real. Young, healthy individuals could be targeted for their physical attributes. Black market operations could emerge in regions with weak law enforcement. Entire human lives might be reduced to inventory, harvested for the promise of eternal youth to someone with the right resources. Governments and legal systems around the world are ill-equipped to handle such a shift. Most medical laws define death in terms of brain activity. But what happens when the brain is fine, and the body is not? What legal frameworks govern body swapping? What rights does the donor have, if any? Who owns the new body after the procedure is complete? These are questions we've never had to answer, but they are no longer hypothetical. From a human rights perspective, the implications are equally complex. Do we have the right to alter the human form this radically? Does survival justify such invasive manipulation? Are we creating a new kind of existence that future generations may be forced to accept without choosing it? The ethics of head transplants go far beyond the operating room. They shape the boundaries of what it means to be human, what it means to die, and what it means to truly live. There is also a psychological cost to consider. Waking up in a new body, even a stronger one, could trigger identity disorders, depression, or cognitive dissonance. The brain might reject its new environment not physically, but emotionally. A person may survive the procedure only to live in a state of existential confusion, detached from self and reality. The mental health implications are enormous and largely unstudied. And yet, some argue that not pushing forward is equally unethical. If the technology exists to extend life, to restore mobility, or to rescue those trapped in failing bodies, is it not cruel to withhold it? Should progress be paralyzed by fear, or driven by possibility? This is the moral paradox at the heart of the head transplant debate. In the end, the morality of immortality is not a scientific question, it's a human one. The ethics of head transplants challenge us to define life not just by biology, but by meaning. And as we move closer to making the impossible possible, we must ask ourselves whether we're advancing towards salvation, or blindly stumbling into something we cannot undo. What neuroscience says about consciousness and identity. If a human head is successfully transplanted onto a new body, will the person who wakes up still be the same individual? This is the most haunting question at the intersection of surgery and selfhood. The science of neurology is beginning to peel back the layers of that question, and what we're discovering challenges everything we thought we knew about brain consciousness, identity, and the fragile bridge that links mind and body. Neuroscience has long treated the brain as the control center of the body, the seat of memory, language, decision-making, and emotion. But the deeper researchers explore, the more they encounter complexities that defy simple models. Can you, the essence of your being, truly be transferred from one biological vessel to another? The answer is not as straightforward as many assume. Take, for instance, split brain studies, one of neuroscience's most compelling insights into mind-body dualism. Patients who undergo a severing of the corpus callosum, typically to treat epilepsy, experience a division in brain hemispheres. This procedure isolates communication between the left and right sides of the brain, yet both hemispheres continue to function. These patients often demonstrate two independent streams of consciousness within the same head. In one famous experiment, a patient was asked to draw a shape with each hand at the same time. The hands drew different shapes, as though two separate minds were controlling them. If consciousness can split within the same skull, what happens when the entire body is changed? Another phenomenon that adds to this mystery is locked-in syndrome. Patients with this condition are fully conscious and aware but incapable of moving or communicating, except perhaps through blinking. Their brains are active, their thoughts intact, but their bodies are unresponsive prisons. This disconnection between mind and physical form presents a chilling parallel to what could occur in a head transplant. Even if the brain survives and remains conscious, will it be able to express identity if the body does not respond? The plasticity of the brain complicates the discussion further. Neuroscience identity research shows that the brain is remarkably adaptable. Stroke victims relearn motor functions by rewiring different regions of their cortex. Amputees often report feeling phantom limbs, sensations from body parts that no longer exist. The brain does not simply process the world, it molds itself based on bodily input. That suggests identity is not fixed in the brain alone. It is co-created through a dialogue with the body. What happens, then, when that body is replaced? Would the brain adapt to the new form over time, building new neurological maps and restoring a sense of unity? Or would it reject the new form as foreign, triggering confusion or even psychosis? Some researchers believe that the brain's plasticity offers hope. If recovery protocols included tailored sensory and motor retraining, the brain might be coaxed into bonding with its new shell. Others remain skeptical, warning that too much of our sense of self is encoded in bodily feedback, heartbeat rhythms, gut signals, hormonal cycles, that cannot be replicated perfectly with a foreign body. There is also the emerging field of connectome preservation. A connectome is the complete map of neural connections in the brain. Scientists now believe that our memories, personalities, and even consciousness might be embedded in the architecture of these pathways. Research into preserving and mapping the connectome has become a priority for those pursuing artificial intelligence and brain uploading technologies. But it also has implications for physical transplant scenarios. If the connectome remains untouched during a head transplant, it might be possible to preserve identity, assuming no structural damage occurs. The procedure, however, must be incredibly precise. Even minor trauma to critical nodes. There are documented cases where minor brain injuries have led to major shifts in personality. A man who suffers damage to the prefrontal cortex may lose impulse control. A woman with a lesion in the temporal lobe might experience changes in religious beliefs or sexual identity. If such minor changes can cause profound psychological effects, what might happen when a brain is subjected to the trauma of total bodily replacement? And yet, neuroscience continues to evolve. Experiments with brain-machine interfaces have shown that the brain can control robotic limbs through thought alone. Paralysis patients can move cursors on screens with mental focus. These advances suggest that the brain does not need its original body to function, it only needs a responsive system to communicate with. This offers a glimpse into a future where the brain might be housed in a new form, organic or synthetic, and still retain some measure of function and identity. The great unanswered question in brain consciousness studies is this: is consciousness an emergent property of neural activity, or is it something deeper, perhaps even metaphysical? If it is purely biological, then theoretically it can be preserved, replicated, or moved. If it is more than that, something intangible, then no transplant, however successful, can guarantee the survival of the self. In the context of head transplants, the question becomes even more layered. Will the patient feel like themselves? Will they recognize their voice, accept their reflection, or connect to emotions the way they used to? Or will something fundamental be missing, something we do not yet know how to measure or define? Neuroscience cannot yet provide definitive answers. But it does illuminate the magnitude of what's at stake. Identity is not a singular, isolated thing. It is the result of an intricate dance between brain, body, memory, and perception. Changing one of those elements, especially something as monumental as the entire body, could ripple through the entire system in ways we can't yet predict. And so, we stand at the edge of science and philosophy, guided by studies that are brilliant, but incomplete. The mind may be more adaptable than we thought, or it may be more fragile than we feared. The truth, as neuroscience continues to uncover it, lies somewhere in between. Could head transplants be the path to immortality? The dream of living forever has haunted human imagination for thousands of years. From mythological elixirs to futuristic mind uploads, the quest for immortality has evolved alongside our understanding of science and the self. But among all the theories and technologies that aim to defeat death, head transplants present one of the most visceral and immediate pathways to what some are calling surgical immortality. Unlike cryonics, which involves freezing a body or brain in the hope that future generations will revive it, or mind uploading, which assumes we can digitize consciousness into a machine, head transplants operate within the biological framework we already understand. The body fails. The brain endures. Replace the broken parts, and the thinking, feeling, remembering human can live on. This is what makes the idea so compelling. If human immortality science advances to the point where we can routinely perform full body replacements, death becomes less of a moment and more of a logistical issue. A failing liver or a worn-out heart wouldn't mean the end. And even if the entire body breaks down, the brain could, in theory, be transferred to a younger, healthier frame. That's not just anti-aging surgery. That's the surgical equivalent of a reset button on life. Supporters of this idea argue that a biological reboot might be more appealing than a digital eternity. Mind uploading, while captivating in concept, remains deeply theoretical. We don't know if consciousness can be separated from the organic brain. Copying the data may create a digital replica, but does that replica feel? Does it dream? Does it know it's you? Head transplants, by contrast, offer a solution that doesn't rely on redefining the soul. They simply move it. As biotechnology improves, the bodies used in these hypothetical transplants may not even need to come from other people. Cloning offers one route, creating genetically identical bodies specifically designed to serve as replacements for their original heads. Synthetic biology offers another, lab-grown tissues and organs built from scratch, customized to eliminate genetic disease and slow the aging process. In this future, bodies are interchangeable. They become platforms rather than prisons. Of course, such a future raises immediate questions about accessibility. Would head transplants be available to the average citizen? Or would they, like many other cutting-edge medical breakthroughs, begin as a privilege of the wealthy? It is easy to imagine a world where billionaires, driven by the fear of death and empowered by vast resources, invest heavily in full-body replacements. Some already are. Tech moguls and venture capitalists have quietly poured millions into life extension research, anti-aging surgery, and neural preservation labs. They are not just chasing profits. They are trying to escape the grave. If head transplants ever become viable and scalable, they could shift the global landscape of power and inequality in dramatic ways. The ultra-rich could, in theory, extend their influence indefinitely. Political leaders, corporate giants, and cultural icons could retain their minds and memories while continuously replacing their aging forms. Living forever would no longer be a metaphor. It would be a business plan. But this vision comes with a cost. As human immortality science inches forward, we must ask not just what is possible, but what is ethical. Is it fair to design a world where some can opt out of death while others are left behind? Will we create a biological underclass of those who cannot afford renewal? And more chillingly, will life itself become commodified, another product to buy, sell, or steal? Even without these darker implications, the psychological toll of immortality must be considered. Living forever in theory sounds ideal. But in practice, what would it mean to outlive everyone you know? To walk through generations, switching bodies, but carrying the same memories? Would the mind endure? Or would something essential begin to unravel? Still, for some, the promise is too powerful to ignore. For those suffering from terminal illness, degenerative conditions, or simply the fear of the end, head transplants offer a tantalizing vision of a second chance. Unlike speculative technologies, they offer a path grounded in surgery, biology, and nerve regeneration. It may not be easy. It may not be safe. But it is real. So, could head transplants be the path to immortality? Perhaps not yet. But as the boundaries of medicine continue to stretch and the tools of science grow more precise, the line between death and survival may soon become a matter of choice. And in that world, immortality won't come from magic or machines. It will come from the scalpel. The dangers and limitations of the procedure While the idea of a head transplant captures imaginations and fuels the promise of living longer, the reality remains brutally complex. Beneath the bold headlines and futuristic hopes lies a minefield of risks, complications, and unanswered questions. The dangers of head transplant procedures are not just theoretical. They're grounded in current scientific limitations that could turn this bold surgery into a catastrophic failure. One of the greatest biological threats is immune rejection. Even with modern immunosuppressants, the body remains wired to detect and attack anything foreign. In a typical organ transplant, the immune system might reject a single kidney or liver. In a head transplant, the situation is reversed. The brain remains the same, but the entire body, including its blood, DNA, and immune system, belongs to someone else. This reversal creates a uniquely high-stakes scenario. The new body might treat the brain as an invader. Conversely, the brain could trigger a cascade of stress responses from unfamiliar hormonal patterns. The immune conflict could result in chronic inflammation, systemic failure, or death. The second major challenge lies in the nerves. Specifically, the impossibility of spinal reconnection, at least for now. The spinal cord is the body's primary communication channel, sending signals between the brain and every muscle and organ. Once severed, those intricate nerve fibers are nearly impossible to realign and reconnect with full precision. While experimental treatments like polyethylene glycol and stem cell therapies show some promise, they have not yet demonstrated success in restoring complete motor or sensory function in humans. This spinal fusion failure means that even if the transplant is physically completed, the patient may wake up paralyzed, unable to control their new body. Compounding the physical risks are the psychological consequences. Being placed in a new body, even a healthy one, can create deep cognitive dissonance. The mind expects to feel a certain way, to respond to familiar sensations and movements. A mismatch between expectation and reality can cause severe psychological distress, leading to anxiety, identity confusion, or even trauma. Some researchers fear that this could resemble a form of body dysmorphia magnified 1,000 times, one where the individual sees their reflection and no longer recognizes themselves. There is also the question of whether the brain would even accept the new body. Neuroscience tells us that the brain adapts to the body it grows with. It fine-tunes itself based on hormonal feedback, internal rhythms, and sensory inputs. Introducing an entirely new body could disrupt this delicate calibration. The result might be more than discomfort. It could lead to neurological dysfunction, hallucinations, or a persistent rejection of the self. In essence, the brain might not just reject the body. It might reject the idea of continued existence. Beyond these immediate issues lie the head transplant side effects we can't yet predict. Long-term outcomes are completely unknown. Would the brain's aging accelerate or slow down in a younger body? Would there be unanticipated effects on memory, emotion, or sleep? Would the patient retain their original personality, or would the biological shifts trigger behavioral changes over time? These questions remain unanswered because no successful human head transplant has ever been completed. The excitement around the procedure often overshadows its hard limits. Right now, head transplants are closer to experimental speculation than proven treatment. The risks are monumental. The science, while evolving, is incomplete. And for every promise of life extension or medical breakthrough, there remains a parallel reality, one where the attempt ends in silence, not survival. Until spinal cord fusion is no longer a fantasy, until immune rejection is fully controlled, and until we understand how the brain interacts with a new host body, the dangers of head transplant surgery will remain as significant as its potential. The dream of a second life may be real, but so too is the nightmare that could follow. Future possibilities and conspiracies. As head transplant science continues to evolve at the edge of credibility, whispers about secret experiments, elite agendas, and buried research are growing louder. The intersection of government interest, billionaire ambition, and technological breakthroughs has created fertile ground for both real innovation and wild speculation. What was once dismissed as science fiction is beginning to sound eerily plausible, and some believe the real breakthroughs aren't happening in public view, but behind closed doors. There are persistent rumors that certain governments are already testing versions of this procedure under black budget programs. These programs, often linked to military or intelligence sectors, operate outside the boundaries of public oversight and are known for exploring radical biological experiments. Whistleblowers and investigative journalists have occasionally hinted at labs working with spinal regeneration, synthetic organ manufacturing, and extreme neurological procedures. While no evidence directly confirms that a human head transplant has been attempted in secret, the mere possibility fuels the belief that if such a thing were possible, it would happen first in the shadows. Transhumanism, the belief that humanity can and should transcend its biological limitations, has grown from a fringe philosophy into a multi-billion-dollar movement. This ideology argues that death is a technical problem waiting to be solved, and the body is simply outdated hardware. Transhumanist thinkers often support radical life extension technologies, body augmentation, and artificial intelligence integration. For them, the head transplant is not a horror story. It's a prototype for the next step in evolution. In this vision of the future, biology is upgraded like software, and consciousness becomes portable. This philosophy has attracted a very specific kind of backer: billionaires. Tech moguls, hedge fund managers, and global influencers are increasingly investing in life extension initiatives. From anti-aging blood transfusions to cryogenic brain preservation, the ultra-wealthy are preparing for futures that most people can't even imagine. Critics argue that this is where science becomes a tool of exclusion. If the elite have access to bodily replacement, cloned organs, or brain-preserving tech, then the future of immortality becomes deeply unequal. This has led to growing concerns about elite science conspiracies, allegations that a small group of powerful people are quietly working toward physical immortality while the rest of society is left behind to age and die. One of the most intriguing intersections of government and tech lies within DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. DARPA has funded extensive research into brain-computer interfaces, neural mapping, and synthetic biology. Their work has led to projects that allow paralyzed soldiers to move robotic limbs with their minds, and brain chips that can control drones. While none of these projects directly involve head transplants, they signal a growing institutional focus on separating consciousness from the constraints of the body. DARPA brain tech is increasingly viewed as the foundation for something far bigger, tools that could one day enable partial or full brain-body transfer. All of this sounds uncannily like science fiction because that's where these ideas started. But fiction has a history of becoming fact. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein was once a tale of grotesque imagination. Now, organ transplants and electric resuscitation are medical reality. Neuralink, Elon Musk's ambitious brain interface company, is testing chips designed to connect human thought to machines. As dystopian as it sounds, the road from fiction to function is getting shorter every year. The question is no longer whether these technologies are coming. It's who will control them, how they will be used, and whether we're ready for a world where death is negotiable. Head transplants may not be part of any public medical program yet, but the technology, philosophy, and money are converging. Somewhere, the future of immortality is already being built, quietly, perhaps secretly, and maybe with implications that none of us are fully prepared to face. Can you truly escape death this way? The idea of escaping death through a head transplant sits on the razor's edge between science and science fiction. On one side, we have the undeniable progress of medical technology. We've transplanted hearts, faces, and even limbs. We've mapped the brain in greater detail than ever before. In controlled experiments, we've kept severed animal heads alive and conscious for brief periods. These breakthroughs hint at what could one day be possible. The basic science to support a head transplant is slowly taking shape. But the procedure as a whole, one that results in a fully functioning human living with a new body, remains unproven. The fantasy is seductive. A dying person preserved through surgery, given a second chance with a new form. But the horror is just as vivid. Spinal fusion that fails. Immune rejection that overwhelms. Consciousness trapped inside a body that doesn't respond. The risk is not just physical but existential. If a head transplant works only partially, what kind of life would follow? And then there's the bigger question. Even if the surgery becomes safe and reliable, even if science eventually answers every technical and biological challenge, should we do it? Can humans live forever, and more importantly, should they? Would immortality lead to enlightenment, or loneliness? Would extending life enhance its value, or dilute it? These are questions that no lab can answer. They belong to philosophers, theologians, and you. Because at its core, the head transplant debate isn't really about medicine. It's about meaning. It asks us to define the self, the soul, and what it means to truly live. It forces us to consider whether death is a problem to be solved, or a boundary to be respected. So, is the head transplant real? Not yet. But the science is moving. The questions are growing louder. And the moment we cross the line from theory to reality, everything we know about life, death, and identity will change forever. Would you risk it? Would you trade your body for a shot at more time? Tell us in the comments. We want to know what you think. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video if you'd survive with a new body. For more on human immortality, neuroscience, and bizarre medical experiments, check out our other videos. And if you thought this was wild, wait until you see what's coming next.